Welcome. Hi. Oops, I don't have my screen showing. Sorry about that. Jay, are you seeing my screen now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, welcome. My name's Jennifer Griffith, and I work at NEMOA, which is the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association. So we are an interstate association. The 6 New England states, New York and New Jersey, work together. NEMOA is focused on waste issues and also toxic use reduction and toxics in products, but as well as the wayside cleanup programs work together through NEMOA. So one of the priorities of NEMOA is training for state staff, but also opening that up to anybody, and as well as PFAS has been a priority for our state since about 2016. So we're combining those two today to have another one of the webinars in our series that are focused on PFAS. Today we're talking about PFAS in wastewater, and we've got two great presenters today. And after the webinar, in a few days, I will be posting their presentations on the NEMOA website. So that's part of why I have the website showing here, is so that you can be knowing a little bit more about what NEMOA is, but also I'm going to show you where you will be able to, in a few days, find the presentations from today as well as other PFAS webinars. So this is NEMOA's homepage. Then on the left side, there's a wayside cleanup button. You click that. Goes over here. Here's the different things, but events. And then we've got, this goes backwards. The most furthest thing out in the future is at the top, and then it goes backwards. So you have to scroll down. And here's all the other webinars that will be coming up in this series. And then you get down to past events, and that's where you will find the slides from today. Will be a past event. Here's the other past events. A lot of these are on PFAS, but we also do other types of topics. If you're working the wayside cleanup program, you might want to be looking at some of the other presentations that are posted here. And you know, in the more distant past, we used to do live in-person workshops, and also so there's a full day's worth of presentations posted for some of these workshops that we've done in the past. So with that, I will stop my introductory remarks here and move on to introduce our first presenter. Our first presenter is Justin, or Jay Pimpare. He's a regional pretreatment coordinator for the 6 states within EPA New England's regional office. Jay oversees and coordinates all pretreatment activities throughout New England and has played an integral role in providing technical assistance to wastewater treatment plants related to pretreatment program implementation issues. Prior to his position as regional pretreatment coordinator, Jay was a multimedia investigator with EPA's Investigations and Analysis Unit at EPA's regional laboratory. He's been involved in the pretreatment program since joining EPA in 1993 and has a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. And with that, I will turn it over to Jay.
Great, thank you. Can you see my screen, Jennifer?
Yes, I can. So you're all set to go.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I just wanted to give you a little bit, let you know I am alive. I am here today. It is Tuesday, April 6th, or at least that's what the calendar tells me. It seems like every day is a Tuesday these days. I'm going to put my camera on for a brief moment here. Otherwise, it looks like my screen looks like I'm trying to land a 747 here at Logan Airport with all of the controls around here. As mentioned, I'm the regional pretreatment coordinator with EPA New England. I've been in the program for almost 30 years now. I am an engineer. I am not a scientist. I am not a chemist. I hope that there are some questions at the end, but if you want to play Stump the EPA guy at the end here, This is not the webinar to do that. With respect to questions on treatment technologies or scientific definitions and getting into the nitty-gritty of PFAS, I am merely here to give you a regulatory update with respect to water and wastewater, and a little bit of drinking water for that matter, with the NPDES program on some national and some regional issues. So I hope you enjoy the presentation. I'm gonna shut my camera off because I'm also dealing with a little bit of a head cold here. When you work from home, as Bill Belichick, of the coach of the New England Patriots, says, there are no days off. So again, hope you enjoy here. Just moving along, I wanted to provide a little bit of an overview, a presentation overview of some national PFAS water program highlights, touch upon the pretreatment primer. There's a lot going on with PFAS within different medias, air, water, to include wastewater and drinking water and biosolids, and updates seem to be happening on a weekly, if not a daily basis. Therefore, I thought it would just be best to discuss a few highlights or initiatives that are occurring at the national and regional levels, give you a little bit of an overview of the industrial pretreatment program, and a primer on that would be good for those who are unfamiliar with the pretreatment program and how we regulate industrial users that discharge into our municipal wastewater systems. Quick update on the Effluent guidelines program. There is a proposed rulemaking out there on the OCPSF category. That's the organic chemicals, plastics, and synthetic fibers category. A little bit of mapping that we've done along the Merrimack River for New Hampshire and state of Massachusetts. And that's actually what I was originally asked to talk about here, but I felt that there's so much more information to provide than talk about a map for 30 minutes. A little bit of an update on an NPDES permitting strategy. I wanted to share with you our regional efforts to include PFAS language in NPDES permits within the state of Massachusetts. And then lastly, the state of Massachusetts initiative and some great work that's being done by the Massachusetts Office of Technical Assistance. So PFAS, I promise you that this slide is merely up there just for a background. I'm sure that most of you have seen this 4,000 times already, but not everybody is a PFAS expert. For those just getting their feet wet with the acronym PFAS, or for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, they're basically a group of synthetic chemicals that have been in use since around the 1940s. They've been used for decades to manufacture household and commercial products that resist heat, oil stains, grease, and water. PFAS have been used in commercial products, including that nice fancy non-stick cookware that you see on the infomercials, Teflon resistant, etc., stain resistant furniture and carpets, fast food wrappers, pizza boxes, shampoo, dental flosses. Safe to say that PFAS is in many different products that are out there today. Two of the most studied PFAS compounds are PFOA and PFOS. Unfortunately, because of their widespread use and environmental persistence, most people have actually been exposed to PFAS chemicals, whether or not you know it or believe that. Some of these PFAS chemicals can accumulate and stay in the human body for long periods of time, and there's also evidence that exposure to certain PFAS may lead to adverse health effects. PFAS are basically chemicals that are in drinking water, groundwater, compost, soil, food, and the blood of 98% of Americans that have been tested. That's astonishing. I don't know if anyone has ever seen the movie Dark Waters. I watched it when it first came out about a year or so ago, and I personally thought it was a great movie. I encourage anyone to view it because it will open your eyes to the world of PFAS, or should I say PFOS, because that is the acronym that the movie used. Some often refer to the chemical PFAS as a forever chemical because it just doesn't go away. I think the take-home message here is that PFAS is not going away unless we eliminate its use altogether. And yes, there are initiatives that are out there to do just that at the regional and national level. Here at home in the state of Massachusetts, there is a Clean Water Action Plan to ask the Massachusetts legislators to ban PFAS in food packaging, carpets, rugs, pesticides that are used in the state's mosquito program, and then also to label and to ban PFAS in firefighter personal protective equipment, also to ban PFAS in child's products. children's products. And I know that there are other national bans as well. Just remember that even if certain large companies in the United States are no longer using PFAS, products manufactured outside of the United States still may contain PFAS. Quick little update, our EPA's action plan. This is a plan from February 25th, 2020. I'm not going to get into all the nuts and bolts of that, but I just want to let everybody know, people always ask the question about what's going on now. I want to say that we have a new administration within the United States government. President Biden has highlighted the importance of in his commitment to tackling PFAS pollution and protecting public health and the environment. EPA is committed to taking action to better understand and ultimately reduce the potential risks caused by these chemicals, including how to safely dispose of PFAS, clean up PFAS in the environment, and address PFAS contamination in water. Our actions to address these chemicals will be underpinned by science and will support the agency's efforts to develop effective regulation and provide improved public health protection for all Americans. So as we look at these types of reviews, we're trying to ensure that environmental policies, decisions, guidance, and regulations that impact and protect the lives of Americans are informed by the best available science, as well as rest on a strong foundation of science. And just to reiterate, we are committed to listening to the public and working together with our states, drinking water and wastewater systems, and local communities that have been impacted by PFAS to identify flexible and pragmatic approaches that will deliver critical public health protections. Next slide here is just the updates. The only reason I want to put this up there is just to highlight the fact that we received over 120,000 comments submitted to the public document that went out in February of 2020. I think that's just goes to show the large number of individuals that are involved in PFAS. So fast forward, a quick little update. January 2021, although there were many highlights that were public, that are available to the public, I did just want to hit upon those that, again, I'm solely sticking to the wastewater components, but drinking water plays a pivotal role here, so I want to include them as well. We are moving forward on regulating PFOA and PFAS in drinking water by issuing final regulatory determinations and making available new data on PFAS in drinking water. So with respect to wastewater, the agency did announce an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to collect data and information regarding manufacturers of PFAS and the presence and treatment of PFAS and discharges from the OCPSF subcategory. EPA is in the middle of a public comment period now, requesting information regarding PFAS formulators. And this action is based on information that the agency collected as described in the recently finalized ELG program Plan 14, which I'll talk about in a little bit further. So any information collected through these actions will help further inform whether industrial sources warrant regulation through the National Effluent Guidelines Program. And again, with respect to wastewater, we're talking specifically about the OCPSF subcategory. And you can find out all of the information at this lovely webpage down below here, epa.gov/PFAS. As far as some standards go, EPA has issued a drinking water health advisory of 70 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFAS. That is not a regulatory standard, that is a health advisory. We are pursuing to develop National Clean Water Act human health and aquatic life criteria for PFAS as that data supports. The states are also actively developing drinking water and ambient water quality criteria. I think it's safe to say that the states are, which you'll see on the next slide, states are probably a little bit ahead of the curve here. And I know that as some of the states, specifically here in New England, Vermont, New Hampshire, just to name a couple who've done some really great work, are also in the process, and I think many other states are as well, as far as developing biosolids criteria, or attempting to develop some biosolids criteria for land application of municipal sludge. So, little update on the New England regulations of where we are today with respect to drinking water. And I'll tell you why I'm talking about drinking water. If you're questioning why this is a wastewater workshop, or webinar, I've never talked so much about a drinking about drinking water so much as I have in this presentation. Connecticut is at 70 ppt, equal to that of the EPA Health Advisory. Maine as well. Massachusetts is a little bit more stringent with 20 ppt. New Hampshire, you will see the asterisk next to New Hampshire. While the state did establish these drinking water standards, there have been some legal challenges to the stricter standards as well as the enforceability. So I would encourage you to check with the state for any current updates on the regulation. And Vermont also has adopted a 20 parts per trillion. Again, the states have the authority to regulate on their own and be more stringent and develop more stringence than the federal government, which is often the case in the real world here. And for the reason for that is that the states develop standards that are more site or state specific. And over the past couple of months here, I have received some inquiries from POTWs wanting to accept hauled landfill leachate. And in a couple of circumstances, the landfill has proposed to treat the leachate down to less than the state drinking water standard. In this recent case, it was the state of Massachusetts and 20 parts per trillion. So we've been asked if we support this approach of accepting such a waste if it were guaranteed to be less than the state drinking water standard. Well, first off, I want to say that we always treat these issues on a case-by-case situation. We work with our states to gather all pertinent information so that we have a solid understanding of the entire approach. Now remember that a hauled waste is typically discharged directly to the headworks of the wastewater treatment plant. Therefore, there is little to no dilution with other waste within the collection system. There's always the debate of whether or not actual removal of PFAS is occurring within a traditional activated sludge treatment works. So we'll assume for the sake of argument, there is little to no removal of PFAS across the treatment plant. Lastly, we have to consider the receiving water of the POTW discharge and its proximity to a drinking water intake. And in this particular situation, there was a drinking water intake not too far downstream of the POTW effluent discharge. Therefore, in the example provided of having a POTW set a permit limit equal to that of a state drinking water standard, EPA would support this approach, given the close proximity of the POTW discharge to a downstream drinking water intake. So again, we really have to take into consideration drinking water standards in the absence of any federal regulatory drivers like water quality criteria, NPDES permits, and or land application. A little bit switching gears now to the pretreatment program, which is what I do on a daily basis here. I want to give you just a little bit of a pretreatment primer, the Clean Water Act, the NPDES program, which I'll use that acronym quite a bit. NPDES stands for the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. Allowed for the NPDES allowed for the federal government and states to issue NPDES permits or permits directly to wastewater treatment plants that discharge directly into a receiving water of the United States. And it also allowed for the promulgation of the General Pretreatment Regulations 40 CFR Part 403 in January of 1981. I think this picture here of this gentleman standing over, it looks like a metal finishing or an electroplating tank, was probably taken in 1981. And for those in the pretreatment program, you've probably seen this a few times. Aside from the many safety issues here, I think it's also safe to say that the electroplating and metal finishing industries are one of the prime categories that EPA is looking at with respect to sources of PFAS. So overall, the industrial pretreatment program, when we think about PFAS and its impact on the POTW, we ask ourselves, what is the real impact here? What are we really trying to protect? Well, first off, we're trying to prevent pass-through and or interference. And both of these definitions, among many other things, include a violation of the NPDES permit. With PFAS, we don't have a regulatory driver in setting of federal limits on the receiving stream, water quality, biosolids, etc. So we don't have a violation of the NPDES permit, unless, of course, a state has adopted such a limit and placed it in the permit, which at the federal level has not yet occurred. So when you look at the plan here, and I don't know if you can see my mouse moving around or not, but there are two sources of discharge, really. There's one point source discharge to a receiving stream here, wastewater from a POTW. Most often, not all the time, let's go into a groundwater source is discharge out to a receiving stream. Secondly, another criteria we have to be worried about is the land application aspect of this and limitations on sludge disposal, etc. There have been many case studies out there where groundwater contamination has occurred as a result of municipal sludge being land applied at farms, etc., and has got into the groundwater and contaminated or gotten some of the feedstock or livestock a little bit sick. So one thing I think we have to do here is to educate residents of the municipal systems and provide them with a further understanding that once you flush a toilet, the water or wastewater is not gone. That water will ultimately end up as someone's drinking water, since there are many occasions whereby a drinking water intake is located downstream of a POTW effluent. And one common wastewater source we've often heard about is school janitors dumping wastewater down the drain that may contain PFAS as a result of cleaning compounds used in the floor wash. So again, when we look at the treatment plan, I've tried to get rid of this explosion, damage, and injury to worker help. This is from another slide. Did my best, but I couldn't get rid of it here. We're really concerned about the effluent being discharged to receiving streams due to the drinking water intakes downstream and land application. And again, these treatment plants were not designed to remove, or they were designed to remove conventional pollutants, not heavy metals, and certainly not PFAS. And this is actually a true story here. A pickup truck was lowered into the clarifier here to move the rotating arm around so that they could get some movement with the clarifier. That's a true story. Anyway, definition of SIU, I want to throw this in there because I'm going to use the acronym quite a bit in a little bit. SIU is a significant industrial user. This is the federal definition, and not to bore you for those that are already in the pretreatment program, but the definition includes all categorical industrial users regardless of flow. And then SIUs are also industries that discharge on average 25,000 gallons per day or more of processed wastewater, or are determined to have reasonable potential to adversely affect the POTW's operations. So we move to categorical industrial users. There are approximately 60 industrial sectors that have national technology-based standards in place now. These standards are the same for anyone performing a specific operation, regardless of the location in the United States. Currently now, there are no standards or numerical limits in place for PFAS related to any specific categorical industry. However, we can safely assume that PFAS is present in many of the operations that are listed here on the screen: electroplating, metal finishing, plastics molding and forming, pharmaceuticals. You can throw in landfills, you can throw in OCPSF facilities. The screen's probably is not big enough for me to list all of the categorical industrial users across the nation that most likely contain PFAS. I want to talk a little bit about the Effluent Guidelines plan, because this feeds into their proposed rulemaking. The Effluent Guidelines program annually publishes its preliminary or final plan to evaluate current and potentially new industrial sectors as to whether new or existing standards should be revised. This is certainly not an overnight process. Even in the event of a new guideline, it takes years to develop, and only after a long and thorough review is conducted will a determination be made on whether or not a new ELG or an existing ELG is revised with a new pollutant or a revised pollutant standard. And remember, a standard could be in the form of numerical limits or best management practices. So the Plan 14 was published in January 2021. There is a link here at the bottom of the screen for you to look at that and view that. As part of the plan and PFAS Action Plan, EPA has a multi-industry detailed study ongoing to determine whether or not effluent guideline rulemakings are warranted for any of these 5 point source categories. And those 5 point source categories are, again, OCPSF, commercial airports, pulp and paper, textile and carpet manufacturers, and the metal finishers. And so some of the three decision factors, as you see here on the screen, are wastewater concentrations of pollutants at high enough levels to document treatment. First, based on all of the data, and hopefully, we have enough data to make an informed decision whether or not the concentrations are high enough, and we have representative data from these potential sources. And then, do the documented discharges from the industry warrant a national rule? It would be unfair or to say that if EPA were to collect all the data from, let's say, we looked at breweries and there were no, and I would hope that there's no PFAS coming from breweries, but the brewery sector, EPA evaluated the brewery sector and determined that there were little to no PFAS concentrations in wastewater. It would be hard to warrant a national rulemaking for that industrial sector. So then lastly, are wastewater treatment technologies available? I think it would also be unfair for EPA to develop a national standard and potentially stringent limit if treatment technology did not exist. We've heard over and over that a common GAC system or granulated activated carbon system is a common form of treatment, but that may not be enough. If you're looking at a wastewater treatment plant that has a 50 to 100 million gallon per day discharge, other treatment technologies we've heard are introducing heat at a temperature of greater than 1,000 degrees, and that temperature discussion is always debatable as well. I am not a treatment technology expert. I do listen to the presentations on new treatment. I find them fascinating. I will leave the professionals and the experts in the field to answer those types of questions. So, as part of the PFAS action plan that I spoke about earlier, one of the highlights was to address PFAS in industrial wastewater. Given that, the agency is now taking steps to evaluate if industrial sources warrant regulation to address PFAS discharges. So after studying the available data regarding wastewater discharges from facilities that manufacture PFAS, we are now publishing this advance notice of proposed rulemaking to solicit data and information regarding manufacturers of PFAS and the presence and treatment of PFAS in discharges from the OCPSF category. The proposed rulemaking went out for public comment on March 17th. This is an existing rulemaking. 40 CFR 414 is the existing rule. The long, lengthy link at the bottom of the page is there for you if you would like to review that. We're also requesting information regarding PFAS formulators with this public notice. These are facilities that produce a variety of PFAS products and materials. Both the PFAS manufacturers and formulators are currently regulated under OCPSF, but remember, they are without requirements or limitations for PFAS now. Moving forward, EPA will use any data and information obtained through the public comment on the proposed rulemaking to assist with our decision on whether or not a proposed rulemaking will be necessary. This is a public comment period open for 60 days. It began on March 17th. It will run until May 16th. Since it is now April 6th, we are almost halfway through the public comment phase. I personally believe this is just the first step in looking at the ELG program as to whether other categories should be evaluated. I think you'll probably see that later on, whether or not in the Plan 15 preliminary plan, if it's published later this year or early 2022. I would encourage anyone that has any data on the OCPSF facilities to provide such data and or any information on treatment technologies to EPA prior to May 16th. And I would also encourage you to forward that rulemaking. If you don't have a copy of that rulemaking, send me an email and I'm happy to send that over to you. Okay, switching gears to the industrial pretreatment program within EPA New England, we have 519 wastewater treatment plants. 90 of those are federally approved programs, 62 of which fall within Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And I want to highlight that because in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, EPA is the approval authority, which means that EPA issues the NPDES permit to POTWs within those two states. I believe now there are only 3 or maybe 4 states in the entire country where EPA still issues the NPDES permits, and unfortunately we happen to have 2 of them here in our region. We, as part of having an approved pretreatment program, EPA requires an annual pretreatment report listing, among many other things, significant industrial users. We have 677 of those in Massachusetts, approximately 1,325 in New England. So over half of the users within New England are from the state of Massachusetts. Moving on to our fancy maps here. We were asked, in collaboration with our drinking water section, and kudos to our drinking water, my colleagues who've been a great asset and help with all of this mapping tool in this initiative. We focused on Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Again, we were interested in locating POTWs that discharge or have the potential to discharge PFAS into drinking water sources. We reviewed all of our annual industrial pretreatment reports. We classified those industrial sectors and we ranked them as high, medium, or low. Again, we reviewed 62 industrial pretreatment program reports from municipalities and found that almost half of them, 45%, actually fell within a specific categorical industrial sector. And we ranked them, we gave out a high, medium, and low ranking here. And if an industry was subject to an effluent guideline like metal finishing, textile, landfills, those were the easy heavy hitters. They fell into the high category. We were a little bit conservative here. When we looked at our medium category, we looked at such things as hospitals, and one could argue, some people say, well, there's no PFAS coming from hospital. Others will argue, well, hospitals are a source of PFAS. Well, for the sake of argument, we put them in the medium subcategory here, and then low categories would be like the breweries and restaurants. And again, we used our best professional judgment. We did not consider any particular volume of water when we did our mapping. So this is our map. A few things to point out here. This is for the geography people here. I don't know if you can see my mouse that comes down here through Rochester and Somersworth, Dover, Portsmouth, down the coastline over to Hampton, and then across. That is the state of New Hampshire. We captured a little bit of Maine on the map and a little bit of Massachusetts with Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, Amesbury, and Newburyport. I think New Hampshire, whoever did the land agreements here in New Hampshire, only got 18 miles of coastline. It's the shortest amount of coastline of any state that borders the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean in the United States. Probably should have got a little more. Anyway, when you look at the map here and you see all these municipalities, if you look at the top of the screen, Franklin, that's the Winnipesaukee River Basin Program. And you look at the red would be the high or facilities, the amount of industrial facilities that were ranked in the high category, yellow being medium and green being in the low. You'll see that just because a facility has a lot of green or a lot of yellow, really, I wouldn't pay too much attention to that. What I would pay attention to is, because really what that means is that they had a lot of industries. Like if you look at Lowell at the bottom of the screen, just means that they might have 35 to 40 industries compared to someone like, well, I'll come up here to Merrimack in New Hampshire. And I'm not picking on anybody here. I'm just saying Merrimack may have one of their 3 or 4 industries that discharge to their system that may contain a known source of PFAS. So they get a little, their red is a little bit higher than others. And where you see that over here in Newport in the top left, whereby there's a straight line and the red or the bar graph or whatever graph we're going to call this is below the line there, that means that they're from a non-approved pretreatment program. Those non-approved programs is that the reports are sent directly to EPA. Now, again, we only use the significant industrial users from industrial pretreatment program reports. This is all public information. But if a POTW did not list the SIU, for example, a landfill, which as we all know, landfills, given the data that we know of and have seen, contain high amounts, may contain high amounts of PFAS in their discharge. So if you look at some parts of the state where you say, does that mean there are no sources of PFAS there? Well, the information is just not publicly available, or the industry or the facility has not reported that to EPA. So the drink of water here. We worked with our GIS, that's the Geographical Information System group, in order to identify major facilities that are upstream of drinking water intakes. And through the mapping, we identified we have 60 major NPDES facilities, and major facilities are those that have a design flow of greater than 1 MGD, and 16 drinking water intakes are downstream of major NPDES discharges. And all that means is that for some drinking water intakes, there are more than one, and often many POTWs or NPDES facilities that discharge upstream. So the minimum amount upstream of upstream NPDES discharges of a drinking water intake was 1, and the maximum amount was 33. And the closest NPDES discharger to a drinking water intake downstream was 0.18 miles, which is fairly close. So,
Justin, this is Jennifer. Just 5 more minutes, hopefully.
Okay, we'll try and wrap this up quickly. An interim strategy for PFAS and federal NPDES permits. EPA, there is a national work group, and it has come up with some recommendations. It was a headquarters memo that went out November 22nd, 2020, which, among many other things, provided some recommendations. The recommendations were that NPDES permit writers consider incorporating permit requirements for monitoring PFAS at facilities where PFAS are expected to be present in point source discharges. And we all know that whether or not the pollutants, there is a specific EPA permit writers manual in a section that's entitled otherwise expected to be present in the discharge. The section notes that there may be pollutants for which neither the discharger nor the permitting authority have monitoring data, but the permit writer has a strong basis for expecting that the pollutant could be present. So the work group also recognized the need for reliable and accurate analytical methods and resulting data when considering the incorporation of any monitoring provisions in NPDES permits. The work group recommends a phased approach to any potential monitoring provisions, such that monitoring requirements are triggered at a time after EPA's multi-lab validated methods are made available to the public. So I'll jump to your question that I know is going to be coming. I'll try and answer it now. When a validated method will be finalized, I'd be lying to you if I gave you any specific date. How's that for an answer? Having said that, the official position is that EPA expects to have a multi-lab validated PFAS method available sometime in the calendar year 2021. I am hopeful that that occurs, and I'm hopeful that other matrix such as biosolids will not be far behind, if not sooner. So moving forward, and I'll try and wrap this up and spend a few minutes on this one, because this hits near and dear to the people in Massachusetts. EPA New England issues the permits for the state of Massachusetts, and as of July 2020, all NPDES permits, all permits, whether or not it's a minor or a major, will require monitoring requirements for the 6 PFAS compounds that are up on the screen there, PFNA, PFOS, PFOA, PFDA. And the monitoring will be required on the influent and the effluent, as well as the sludge or the biosolids. That will occur once per quarter. This reporting requirement will only be required 6 months after EPA's multi-lab validated method for wastewater. I believe, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first time in the nation that EPA, for that matter, will be requiring such monitoring. I know that some states, and I know Michigan has been on the forefront, is also requiring some monitoring. And so if there are any states out there that are actually requiring monitoring in your POTW permit, I'd be interested if you could just put that in the chat box. That would be great. So again, 6 months after EPA has validated a method for wastewater, the influent and effluent monitoring will come into play. And secondly, 6 months after EPA has a validated method for biosolids, the biosolids monitoring will take effect. These are composite samples and they report only. There are no numerical limits. I will also say that the state of Massachusetts is also issuing a state issued permit. The only difference between the Mass permit and the EPA permit is that the state of Massachusetts is not putting a time frame on it. They are requiring permitting to be done immediately. And then there is a pretreatment component as part of the NPDES permits here. And we are in the language states that the permittee, that's the POTW, shall commence annual sampling of the following types of industrial discharges into the POTW. And those are the platers, metal finishers, landfill leachate, CWT. So if you are a POTW and you have any of these industries that fall within this specific industrial sector, you are required to annually sample these their discharge, again for the 6 PFAS compounds, and again the time frame will take effect 6 months after EPA has issued validated an approved methodology. And my last slide here, I want to briefly give you an update on the Mass OTA DEP EPA, what an acronym that is, PFAS initiative title. The Massachusetts Office of Technical Assistance, otherwise known as OTA, is a state agency that offers free and confidential pollution prevention and toxic use reduction assistance to Massachusetts companies. They offer assistance to industries or manufacturers themselves, and in this case, not to the POTWs directly. For this initiative, OTA is partnered with DEP and EPA to offer to help manufacturers identify and hopefully avoid the potential use of PFAS in an effort to avoid inadvertent discharges into POTWs. They're offering free and confidential assistance to the industrial users to identify and reduce PFAS. The industrial users were picked from the 3 communities that you see, Marlborough, Westboro, and Lowell, from annual pretreatment reports. And hopefully we look forward to seeing some great results and hopefully reductions of PFAS in our collection systems. And I want to thank Tiffany Skogstrom at OTA and Jennifer Wood at Mass DEP for doing a brunt of the work here. EPA has merely been a liaison between all the parties involved. So I know hopefully I didn't run over there. That was the end. This is not a chance to stump EPA. Again, I'm happy to answer any questions on the presentation from the regulatory side, or try and answer any questions you may have at this time. Are we doing questions now, Jennifer, or are we waiting?
Great, thanks, Justin. So yes, of course, after you started, I remembered one thing that I skipped over in my introduction, which was that there's way too many people on the webinar today for people to ask questions verbally. So you need to type them into the question box, and I will be keeping track of those. And you can type questions in at any point, so keep that in mind for the next presentation. And I will just quickly go through some of the ones that have come in, one of which is about the presentation. So after the webinar ends, I will get the presentations, a PDF of them from the presenters, and then they'll get uploaded onto the NMOA website. That process takes a few days, but by the beginning of next week, the presentation PDFs should be available for you all to have as a reference. Someone asked about the movie that Justin J had mentioned at the beginning. There's actually 2 that I would recommend. So Dark Waters is the one about, it's a Hollywood movie, so it's a little more dramatized. And then, but there's also a documentary called The Devil We Know. I think it's We Know, it might be They Know, The Devil We Know. And that's more of a documentary, but it's also very well done about this, if you want your friends and colleagues to know more about what you do and why. So let's see, there's a few other more technical ones. Let's see, is there any indication within EPA that you're going to do regulatory actions with beyond PFOA and PFAS? Do you know?
That's a great question. I don't know if that's directly related to drinking water or wastewater. PFOA and PFAS are the 2 that we've identified on the drinking water. But if you look at, there are 29 drinking water compounds that are also looking to be regulated. So I would say it's safe to say we are going beyond PFAS and PFOA.
Okay. So yeah, and states have gone beyond that. So that's, I think, why you've incorporated the 6 into the Massachusetts permits, because Massachusetts has 6. Yes?
Correct. Yes, states have the authority to be much more stringent and apply additional standards than the federal government. But I think it's safe to say that everyone is looking beyond PFOA and PFAS.
Okay, is EPA going to require testing of the PFAS compounds at all POTWs, or will certain POTWs, like small ones, be exempted?
So the requirements that I talked about on the last slide were specific to the state of Massachusetts only. I think EPA New England is, give our NPDES permit folks a pat on the back. We're ahead of the curve. As you see, the work group recommendations that were come out were created so that we have national consistency across the board for those requirements. So I think it's safe to say that coming down the line, you will see this across the country. I know we have a lot of individuals here outside of the state of Massachusetts. But again, those requirements that I talked about are only in the state of Massachusetts NPDES permits that are being issued or drafted after July 2020.
Okay. So is that 2020 or this summer, 2021? Last summer?
July, yeah, we started with this initiative back in July of 2020.
Okay. So we'll take a couple more, and then we're going to move on, and we can come back to some of these other questions at the end. So how many permit cycles does EPA anticipate collecting and reviewing data? And when would it be published, and when would you draw conclusions from it?
Well, if you're talking about permit cycles and the NPDES program, I have to chuckle here. All this information that's submitted that we are requiring or asking for is all public information. So it'll be available to the public immediately. I have to chuckle because permit cycles are typically on a 5-year basis, but we all know that NPDES permits are not issued, unfortunately, in the timely manner of 5 years. They often go much beyond that. I would like to think that a year from now or 2 or 3 years from now, that if I were to give this a similar presentation, it would contain a lot more data. And I think that's really where we're going. All the information, all the data that's provided as part of these public comments and any requirements of the NPDES permit is all public information. And I would hope that, and I'm sorry I don't have more data today, we're still trying to collect that data, but again, in the near future, that when we start to give these presentations, we talk about what we're seeing from the data as a result of these requirements placed upon POTWs and the data that has been collected as part of the rulemaking on the OCPSF facilities.
Great. Okay, and we'll just take one more, and then we're going to move on. But are wastewaters from car washes and dry cleaners and industrial laundries being looked at?
That is a great question. They are being looked at. It was not specifically highlighted in the Effluent Guidelines Plan. I would encourage you to submit more public comments to that when the preliminary plan does come out. Which will be hopefully later this year, 2021. We're always looking at industrial sectors. Yes, those sectors may have known contaminants of PFAS in them. If you have any data on that, we would love to see that. I think really the big thing here is, we're looking at all sectors, but there's just not a lot of data out there to support that. And unfortunately, as I've alluded to, we don't have an approved methodology for wastewater. We have one for drinking water, but we don't have one for wastewater. And perhaps, hopefully, when we do, there will be more initiatives to go out there and pull samples and sample for many different industrial sectors with an approved methodology that gives us great results.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Jay. And we will come back to some questions probably for you at the end, but I think in the interest of time, we should move on. So our next presentation, so we went from sort of a more general pretreatment program. We're going to move on now to some really deeper dive technical stuff about what happens at the wastewater treatment plant. So our next presenter is Farshad Ibrahimi. He's a third-year PhD candidate in environmental engineering at Temple University, where he is working on a collaborative research project between Temple University and Drexel University to improve their all of our understanding of PFAS partitioning behavior in sewage solids, including sewage sludge and biosolids. He's got a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Sharif University of Technology in Tehran, Iran, and a master's degree in civil engineering from the University of South Florida in Tampa. So with that, we will turn it over to Farshad. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. I think Jennifer gave the introduction. So you can see my picture on the screen. I'm a PhD candidate working primarily on PFAS, and two of my favorite media in the environment are solid and biosolids. So with the nice presentation that we had from Justin, we know all these regulatory efforts that are ongoing with regard to PFAS. But what I'm really focusing on is a rather neglected media, the sewage solid and biosolid, which is currently no regulation. And I'm going to look at some of those aspects and what happens and that can affect the leaching and distribution of PFAS to the environment. So the title of my presentation is Linking PFAS Partitioning Behavior in Sewage Solids to the Solid Characteristic, Solution Chemistry, and Treatment Processes within the wastewater treatment plant. I am collaborating with a group of very smart people at Temple at Drexel University, and I have to definitely acknowledge them first. I also need to thank the financial support that we receive from the Water Research Foundation, National Science Foundation, and the Army Research Office. Okay, so the introduction, I know that there have been lots of talks, and probably a lot of us know what's PFAS, but it's always nice to take a deep look at what are these poly and perfluorality substances and why they're important and causing so much problem for us. So these are synthetic compounds, and they've been using in a number of consumer goods for over 50 years. The highly fluorinated alkyl chain, the saturated bonds of fluorine and carbon is creating a lot of unique features for PFASs, which make them persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. And also, they're volatile and they're ubiquitous, and they're found in almost all environmental media, as well as in our body and in animal bodies. So by persistency, I mean that they can't be degraded easily. That's one of the reasons that they're causing a lot of problems, because they can't be efficiently removed from conventional treatment methods. And the bioaccumulative property means that the ability that they have to partition into the tissue of our body. And a number of studies have linked the adverse health effect that they pose to the ecosystem as well as to our health. So more than 4,000 compounds, and they're present in chart form in the environmental relevant pHs. The surfactant behavior due to the structure that they have. I forgot to show you the general structure of PFAS on the first slide, the PFOA and PFOS. As you can see, the hydrophobic alkyl chain that cause the hydrophobic properties and the features, and the charged hit group, which make them polar. So this dual feature makes them surfactant, meaning that they have ability to be solved in both polar and non-polar solvents. And the ability to partition to solids in the environment, such as sludge and biosolids, was very important and concern worthy. I've included kind of in a scheme, a map of the exposure routes that how these PFASs can eventually end up exposing themselves to the human bodies. They can stem from these large industrial facilities to the everyday products, food packaging, cookwares, and everything, and can like be directly near our human tissues, our bodies, and everything like that. But the focus of my research is the wastewater treatment plants as the hotspot. It's important because all of these products, all of these exposure routes can eventually be dumped into a wastewater treatment plant. And since we don't have efficient removal methods implemented in a wide range of wastewater treatment plants, we have to deal with those PFASs in the wastewater treatment plant. And they partition to the sewage solid, meaning the secondary sludge and the biosolid, which creates a number of problems, which I'm going to talk about. So the biosolids, the stabilized secondary sludge, which are very rich in nutrients, have been traditionally used and applied in agricultural lands. More than 60% of the total biosolids have been directly applied to agricultural lands. And a study from 2013 showed that this application can result in a net mass of 3,000 kilogram PFAS per year, which is very high. The PFAS concentration, to give you some background about the levels, can range from 68 to 219 nanogram per gram in activated sludge. So I've also included a schematic of a wastewater treatment plant. Sorry for all these abbreviation acronyms. So this is like a primary clarifier, the treatment filter unit, activated sludge, and aerobic or anaerobic digester. So the point of including this schematic from a study from 2006 is that we are seeing PFAS in every single step of the wastewater treatment plants. After each method, they're not efficiently removed. In some cases, we see some increase, and that could be due to some of the transformation of the precursors, or some decrease, or probably some dilution effects. But the point is, they're there, and they're like eventually end up in both the aqueous phase, aqueous effluent, and the solid effluent. So I'm going to present some of the findings that we have from the first phase of the project, which we looked at a variety of potentially effective parameters that can affect the leaching of PFAS from secondary sludge and biosolids. And I'll refer you to the paper that we published on the results, which you can find all the results in more detail, and some of the analysis that we performed and I didn't include in this study. So the graphical abstract of what we did is that we try to include a number of parameters with regard to the sludge and biosolid. We looked at characteristics of the solid, such as protein, lipid, some other characteristics such as size, hydrophobicity, and aromaticity. We look at some of the characteristics of the PFAS, such as the chain length, the head groups, and CF versus the CH bonds, that how they can affect the leaching potential of PFAS, and the solution chemistry, such as pH, and the concentration of metals in the solution. We also looked at the effect that treatment processes, such as stabilization methods, can have on the PFAS partitioning behavior or PFAS partitioning coefficient. We used to call them, and we are calling them KD as partitioning behavior. This is like a quantitative way to refer to a partitioning coefficient, which is essentially the ratio of the PFAS concentration in the solid phase to the concentration in the aqueous phase. Higher KD implies that we have higher concentration in the solid phase. So this is something that I'm going to talk about a lot. So the experimental design included 14 different PFASs from different head groups and chain lengths. We also included different solution chemistry, to assess the effect of pH, ionic strength, and calcium concentration. And we also collected a variety of sludge and biosolid samples from different treatment plants. So we collaborated with 9 or 10, even varying over different seasons, different treatment plants. They are employing different secondary treatment and stabilization methods. The secondary methods included activated sludge, thickening filter, PNR, and rotating biological contactors. And the stabilization method included anaerobic and aerobic digestion and composting. So we collected all these samples, and I've included a table to summarize the results, summarize the plants and the type of the method that they implement in to treat wastewater. So the experimental design included 2 parts, the isotherm studies and the AGES studies. The isotherm looked at the equilibrium study to see the partitioning behavior that they exhibit. So we included 7 different treatment or concentrations of PFAS. We spiked the samples with varying level of PFASs, mixed them with solution chemistry of a specific, and we mixed them in a tumbler to achieve equilibrium based on literature for 7 days, and then quantitated both phases after equilibrium. The AGES study refers to the solution chemistry parameters, and we varied pH to reflect environmentally relevant values, 6, 7, 8, different values of ionic strength that we adjusted with ammonium nitrate. And we also spiked samples with calcium to just have an idea of the effect that divalent metals such as calcium can have on the partitioning coefficient. So after the equilibrium, we quantitated PFAS. We actually quantitated both the aqueous and the solid phase. So I'll start with the aqueous phase. So the centrifugation was the first step to separate the solid and the liquid. We subsampled to measure some of the characteristics of the system. And the cleanup step mainly included centrifugation, and we quantitated PFAS by spiking internal standards and using the LC-MS QTOF system that we have in our lab. The solid quantitation happened through extraction of PFAS from the solid with the use of heat, sonication, shaking, and eventually the cleanup method was taking advantage of NB-carb or activated carbon. And finally, we analyzed the system, the solids with the LC-MS system that we have. I forgot to mention that we spiked the solids with internal standards at the beginning of the process to measure the possible losses, and we follow the robust method of quantitation and extraction from Higgins' lab. They referred to here. PFAS that we included reflected 3 families of PFAS, perfluorocarboxylate and sulfonate, and fluorotoluene sulfonate. I have included the structures of these 3 families, which reflect some of the most popular PFASs that we are concerned with. This is a chromatogram of the standards that we achieved by developing the method in our lab by optimizing the system and through the isotope dilution method that is very common for quantitation of this family of chemicals. Okay, so let's take a look at the results that we achieved from this study. So first, we started looking at the secondary sludge, which is the sludge that is resulted from the biological treatment. We found out that most of the isotherms are pretty linear. I've included a breakdown of the distribution of the isotherms in our system which mainly exhibited linear behavior. I've also included some examples that what I mean by different partitioning behavior. If you look at the left-hand side figure, especially for the longer chain, you could see that this is the partitioning behavior that the solids exhibited with regard to this analyte, PFUNA or PFUDA. And it means that we are seeing some concentration effect, especially at the higher concentration, versus a linear isotherm shows no effect from concentration. So there are some hypotheses with regard to why we see this linear behavior mostly, and that includes the substantially porous texture of this sludge that kind of provides a lot of absorption sites for PFAS. So there is no limitation, and we see a linear behavior with regard to partitioning behavior. Again, just to refresh our mind about the terminology, by CS, I mean the concentration of the PFAS in solid, CW, the concentration of PFAS in the aqueous phase. This is a linear model. And the Farshad model is the one with an exponent on the aqueous phase concentration. Okay, a more interesting result that we got from the secondary sludge was that they showed no significant differences with regard to PFAS KD, meaning that all of the sludges that we collected from different treatments, such as activated sludge, trickling filter, DNR, they showed almost the same KD, which implies that there is basically no significant difference with regard to PFAS KD. So if you go with activated sludge or trickling filter, you would expect to get the same partitioning coefficient. However, we acknowledge that the effect that we saw in this part of the study could be canceled out by the variable influence sources and the different sludge compositions that we observed in the lab. Later on, I'm going to talk more about the composition and the effect that the solid characteristic might have on PFAS KD. But partitioning behavior in biosolid had a different story. We saw significantly different behavior with regard to PFAS KD in samples collected from anaerobic digestion, aerobic digestion, and composting. As you can see, for all 14 PFASs, anaerobic digestion was consistently higher in terms of PFAS KD, and after that, aerobic digestion, which was in the middle, and composting that had the lowest level of PFAS KD. And I've also included a more intensive isotherm for P4 on the right-hand side to show you how consistently the PFAS KD was higher for them. So this is a motivation of the second phase of the project, that we looked at these biosolids to kind of figure out why we are seeing these differences and how we can answer this research question, that what is responsible for this behavior. Also, another finding from this study was that a comparison between the biosolid and the secondary sludge, and we found that the stabilized solid, meaning the biosolid, have consistently lower PFAS KD compared to secondary sludge. And I've included an example from one of the plants that employ trickling filter coupled with a composting stabilization unit. You can see the significantly different behavior of the sludge and biosolid, which we kind of saw the same pattern across other plants, which means that stabilization decreased the absorption capacity of PFAS. Solution and solid characteristics. These characteristics of solution and also solid were kind of the last part of the first phase, which we found out that the elevated mono and divalent cations increased PFAS KD, while high pH decreased PFAS KD. And with regard to the solid characteristics, we found that protein was the stronger predictor for PFAS KD compared to the organic matter and lipid fraction. On the right-hand side, I've included a summary of the statistical analysis that we performed using multiple linear regression and also using all the sludge samples that we had. So these regressions, this figure includes all the coefficients that we have from each parameter. The green triangles are the coefficients that shows how sensitive PFAS KDs are with regard to calcium, and shows that calcium are more effective compared to ammonium. And on the negative slope or the coefficient with regard to pH, the red dots imply that increasing pH actually is associated with decreased PFAS KD. Very well. So with that, I conclude the first phase of the project, and we move on to the second phase, which we're trying to explain the differences that we saw with regard to biosolid partitioning behavior. So we saw those statistically different PFAS KD in biosolids, and now we are trying to characterize these solids with regard to some of the most important characteristics to see what we find. Okay, so the first analysis that we performed on biosolids is called reverse phase analysis, and that's performed by HPLC or high performance liquid chromatography. We implemented a nonpolar C18 column with a nonpolar stationary phase. The idea here is that the solutes that are in the mobile phase and are injected in the column have some sort of interactions with the stationary phase. If we are implementing a C18 or a nonpolar column, it means that there will be some hydrophobic interactions between the solutes and the stationary phase. And if there are more interactions, we expect the solutes to elute later. I've included two analytes here, vanillin and naphthalene, some organic compounds with two different retention times, which shows a different level of hydrophobicity. So what we did with this analysis was we extracted the biosolids and injected them using this method that we adopted from literature that is relating the retention time to the KOW of the analyte. So the KOW, or the partitioning coefficient of water octanol, is a representative of hydrophobicity of the analyte. So in summary, in this method, we included methanol and water and C18 column, and we adjusted the detector to the wavelength of 254 for the natural organic matter, and we took a look at some of the results. So one thing that I forgot to say, we also included varying levels of compounds, organic compounds, to make a calibration curve here in this slide. We got a very pretty linear calibration curve by injecting these compounds of varying levels of hydrophobicity, and then we injected the extracts of biosolids, which were extracted in the lab by sodium hydroxide and formaldehyde. We found that the anaerobic digested solids had the highest level of hydrophobicity. After that, the second level were aerobic digestion, and then the least was composting, which means that the higher levels of hydrophobicity was observed for anaerobic digested solids. And it's interesting because we also saw consistently higher KD for this solid. So by some correlation analysis, we've also found very strong relationship or correlation between the level of hydrophobicity and KD, which can explain some of the behavior that we saw with regard to biosolids. Again, to remind you, we saw the highest level of KD in anaerobic digestion and the lowest with composting. The second analysis that we did was the CHN analysis, was looking at the carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen fractions of the samples. So the idea here is that the carbon to hydrogen ratio can imply and can show the level of aromaticity. So the aromaticity is defined as how linear are the samples. I guess I'm the other way around. So, for example, the benzene has the highest carbon to hydrogen ratio, around 1, compared to hexane, even though they have the same chemical formula. So using this analysis, we characterize the biosolids. And to give you some background information, this carbon to hydrogen ratio can range from 1 to 8 based on what we saw in literature. And I've also included an extreme level of coal, which can go up to 14 to 17. So the results of this analysis showed that the higher level of C over H ratio was assigned to composting. So that means that we are seeing higher aromaticity in composting samples. And we also did some linear regression to relate the reverse phase analysis to the CHN analysis and to the C to H ratio, just to see what we find. So the hydrophobicity correlation with aromaticity was not great, but we saw consistent trends that with increasing C to H ratio, we are seeing lower level of hydrophobicity. And that's interesting because, again, with correlation analysis, we found that there's also a strong correlation in a negative, I would say not positive, but strong negative correlation between higher level of C to H ratio with regard to KD. And the last analysis that we performed was the size exclusion chromatography. To give you some background about this analysis, so the idea here is that, again, using HPLC for characterizing the natural organic matter of the biosolids, and size exclusion chromatography column only has physical interactions with the solutes. I've included the right-hand side figure to show you. So, for example, here, with larger molecule, you would see less amount of interactions and the faster solution time. So this is the idea behind it, and we can separate the molecules or organic matter based on their size or weight. I've also included here the chromatogram of different standards that we injected in our lab, and the different solution time with regard to their size. So here, that's the lowest retention time is assigned to the largest molecules of the standards that we injected. So by including 5 different polymers and acetone as a very small organic molecule, we created a linear calibration curve for SEC, and we injected our extract. And the results showed that here that the anaerobic digestion and aerobic digestion had the lowest retention time, versus the composting had the highest retention time, which is representative of the size of the composting molecule. Again, the longest retention time can be associated with the smaller size of or the weight of the molecules. So from this study, we found a difference in the size or weight of the molecules coming from different stabilization methods, and showed that composting method has a smaller size. Okay, so in conclusion, by looking at all these different parameters in solid and solution and different PFAS characteristics and different methods, what we found that all these parameters are significant parameters and players that can affect the leaching potential of PFAS from sewage solids. Probably the most interesting part of this finding from the first phase was that we found that stabilization can actually make a difference with regard to partitioning behavior of PFAS. And by looking at some of the characteristics of the biosolids in the second phase of the project, we found that the higher hydrophobicity and bigger size of the organic matter can result in higher partitioning coefficient or KD, while higher aromatic fraction may result in lower partitioning coefficient by solid samples. And one other thing is that the source-derived PFAS loads and influent composition are also significant parameters in addition to the current factors. But again, we are looking at what happens within a wastewater treatment plant. There's not much that we can control on the influence side of things. Some of the implications of this work is that probably monitoring the solution chemistry parameters proactively and maintaining a lower pH in wastewater can result in less PFAS leaching across sewage solids. These are merely some of the implications that are kind of directly collected from our work. I'm not an expert in wastewater plants and operations, so each of these parameters, I acknowledge that if we change them, that might also mess up with other parts of the plants and probably the regulations. But on the science side of things, we found that playing with these parameters can actually optimize or minimize PFAS leaching. Another thing, adding divalent cations can reduce PFAS leaching, and that's more effective compared to the monovalent one. We saw PFAS in sludge in biosolids, meaning that stabilization and secondary sludge were not able to remove PFAS efficiently, and that's not new, so we already know that, but again, we confirmed that trend. The sludge stabilization can potentially be optimized to reduce PFAS leaching, as we saw different plants, different stabilization methods resulted in different level of KD, and that can mean that more research is probably needed to see what's happening inside those units. What if we change the SRT, the storage time of the biosolids, the temperature that is applied, or the levels of the humidity, or what happens if we expose them to the sunlight, and how these parameters can affect the leaching potential of PFAS. Some of these parameters are actually being researched in our lab currently, but again, we need to do more work to fully understand the effect of treatment methods. Thank you so much for listening. I guess that's the end of my presentation.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And we do have a bunch of questions, so don't close your slides because I'll start with this one. Can you repeat your point on slide 15? I believe you said protein was a stronger predictor of KD than organic carbon or lipid, but it's not clear to me if more protein equals more or less mobility in the biosolids. How is protein represented in the figure on the slide?
The figure in this slide is on the solution chemistry parameters, the calcium, ammonium, and pH. The results from the solid characteristic, the protein, organic matter, and lipid. We found that by doing some statistical analysis. We did multiple linear regression. We included all the analytes that we had from different treatments, and all of these solid characteristics that we had in the system in that multiple linear regression. And we did the stepwise removal of variables, and we kind of end up with a linear model for each of those PFASs. So what we concluded, we saw that protein was appearing in the models more than the other two characteristics as a significant predictor or the variable in those models. So what we concluded was that protein is probably a more significant predictor compared to the organic matter or lipid fraction. I didn't include the statistical analysis in these slides, and I apologize for that, the confusion for the figure.
Okay. Yeah, people were just interested in the impact of protein. So from a broad treatment and environmental perspective, what is the impact of KD, what is KD? I personally, I don't know. And what would you say that lower KD PFAS in solid versus liquid ratio is better?
Okay, so partitioning coefficient, or KD, is a number, and what that number says is that how much PFAS stays in the solid versus how much is leached into the aqueous phase and can end up in our drinking water or groundwater. So if you can think of biosolids, so we apply the biosolids in agricultural lands, and the PFAS is within those biosolids. we want the biosolid to stay in the solid phase. We don't want it to be mobilized into the aqueous phase and contaminate our drinking water. So the higher KD or the higher concentration of PFAS in solid is probably the best with regard to the environmental implications.
Right. Okay, good. So did you look at using a top assay, looking at the totals and getting at some precursors? Was a test like that performed on any of the samples?
So that's a very good point and very interesting. So in the first phase of the research, we are looking at the quantitative side of things, meaning that we are quantitating KD, measuring concentration of certain analytes in solid and in the liquid, versus a TOP assay is a measure of the total oxidizable precursors that are in those solids, and that's out of the scope of this work. We are having ongoing research which looks at the concentrations of PFAS and their precursors in different solids, but that will be a different research. Hopefully, I'm going to talk about that later.
Okay. Are you or any of your colleagues looking at mass balance study through the wastewater treatment plant?
That is, again, so the mass balance study, I would assume that would be more on the treatment side of things or the removal side of things. And first of all, so we are focused on the partitioning behavior side of things. And second of all, we are not collecting all the influent and the effluent of the system to be able to close the mass balance, and that would be out of the scope of our work. We are not currently doing that in our lab, but that sounds very interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know if maybe some of your other colleagues there at Temple are
not that I know of. I don't think so that very many.
Okay. Was the composting that you did in-vessel composting or static row composting or alkaline stabilized composting? What kind of composting?
It was alkaline composting.
Okay. Let's see. Let's see. Here's a further comment about the KD and the leaching. And if you keep more PFAS in the biosolids, would that maybe give them more opportunity over time to leach out? Whereas maybe it's better to have more of the leaching happen at the treatment plant.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question.
Okay.
Are you talking about
if more PFAS stays in the biosolids, would make them more likely to be released later, in their use and in a less predictable way, rather than if they don't stay in the biosolids and they are partitioned into the water. Might be easier to treat.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting point about the do we want a higher KD or a lower KD? So again, a higher KD will probably take up more PFAS from the aqueous phase within the wastewater treatment plant, and then later on goes to the field and leach that, versus the lower KD kind of takes less PFAS in the first place. But the thing is, so first of all, that would make more sense if we have some at least treatment method in place for the aqueous part. So in that case, probably would make more sense to have lower KD, because we know that, okay, so we have lower KD, more PFAS in the aqueous phase, but we are treating the aqueous phase. But since we are not treating either, I think it's probably more favorable to have higher KD. But again, these are like implications of the work. We are not suggesting or approving any of these methods, or saying that a higher KD is best or the lower KD is the best. We are just talking about the science and the parameters that can actually affect these parameters.
Okay, well, shoot, there's several more questions here, and we didn't quite get to all of them for Jay's presentation either, but we are right here at 3 o'clock. So I think we should probably wrap up this presentation. Let's see. I guess someone does want to point out that there's some research going on at the University of New Hampshire, and he's wondering whether you are aware and in contact with them, or should we put you in contact?
Well, I'm always open to learn more about the ongoing research and to be inspired. That would be great if you want. If they have the ability to send the information through chat, that would be great.
Great. Well, or I'll email it to you later. So great. Well, I think we should wrap up here. Yes, the slides will be available at some point, probably early next week. They'll be up on the website, and everybody that attended today, I will send an email to saying that they are available. So I will, and they'll be posted here as a past event here in the NMOA webpage. So with that, I really want to thank Jay from EPA and Farshad from Temple University for their presentations today. And I hope everybody has a lovely rest of their afternoon. So thank you again, and I'm going to sign off here. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.